Hey everybody, I wanted to do a second discussion video on Chrono Trigger. The one that we had last week was really great. I had some amazing responses from so many of you that really got me thinking more about the game, and I did some research on some very specific points, mostly on how time travel works in this game, due to one kind of chain of comments in particular that I was having with one of the viewers. And one thing that I've learned from this is that I still, even now, feel kind of unprepared to speak on the game from an authoritative standpoint. I think I still need to do a bit more research, read some more interviews. There's actually a ton of material out there in terms of like interviews and just research you can do to delve into this game, as much if not more so than any of the Final Fantasy games I've covered before. I found myself just with so many different sources to look into and to read and watch, and so I'm very excited about the development history portion of the video. There's so much there that I can cover and so much I can talk about and so much to draw from. But I'm still at the moment trying to get my head around some of these some of these concepts for time travel in the game. But I wanted to basically share with you what I've learned so far, even in its kind of elementary stage, and get a little bit of a discussion going to continue where we left off last week. If I don't respond to a comment that you made last week, it's not because I didn't read it, it's not because I didn't like it or didn't appreciate it. If I don't respond to it in this video, it's mostly a lack of time issue, but also I'm just trying to focus on the comments that spurred questions that maybe I haven't gotten fully answered yet. And because of that, I want to bring it up to all of you so that we can continue discussing those things, and so that hopefully I can get a better understanding of how it all works. So that being said, I had a chain of comments with a viewer named Thiago. Thiago's a total beast, by the way. He's been subscribed for a while. Just an awesome guy. He shares resources with me all the time on development updates for Final Fantasy 15. He's a very knowledgeable guy, and I appreciate his input very much. Happened to disagree with him on this particular point that he made. He was talking about how the simplicity of the story in Chrono Trigger is something that he finds that doesn't appeal to him as much as Final Fantasy games or something like that. He says, "I do agree that this is a great asset," meaning the simplicity of the story, "and I like the fact that Chrono Trigger is not pretentious like Final Fantasy in this regard. However, I do love Final Fantasy and other games such as Xenogears for taking a step further, challenging conventional storytelling and daring to throw crazy ideas all over. Because Chrono Trigger doesn't dare, because it's so simple, it's essentially a solid game that story-wise, it didn't stand out to me. It didn't evoke strong feelings beyond, wow, this is a really fun game. And it's possible to be simple and yet extremely engaging. Look no further than Grandia, the first one, if you have never played it." Good thing you brought that up, because I'm going to be covering that game on Monday in a new show. Won't talk about that now, but on Monday, look for a new video. If I'm understanding correctly, make sure that I say that first. I don't want to speak for Thiago. I believe what he's saying is that the simplicity of storytelling in Chrono Trigger is not as admirable as the complex storytelling in Final Fantasy, because it's not pushing any boundaries, and because of that, it doesn't evoke any strong feelings beyond it just being a fun experience. Here is why I disagree with that. Chrono Trigger, despite being a simple story, really spoke to me emotionally in regards to those things. I think it was really powerful that you get to see the pride and arrogance of humanity kind of at the peak of its technological advancement. You have the Kingdom of Zeal, and then the what do they call them? I'm forgetting the term. Earthbound ones, or I can't remember. I think that's what they're called. Anyways, the people on the floating continent of Zeal and the people who have to live on the ice below. There's one particular moment where again, there are spoilers in this. I would have put it in the title, but after Zeal has been destroyed and the inhabitants of Zeal are now having to live with the Earthbound ones, one of the people from Zeal says, "How am I going to survive without my magic?" And you see one of the humble Earthbound ones turn and say something to the effect of, you can survive without magic. It doesn't take magic to survive. Plus, you're not alone. And I loved that moment. I loved the humility of the Earthbound ones, who had been treated so badly by these people from Zeal, who had been subjugated by them, and he turns and extends his hand to help. The humility of those people versus the pride and the arrogance and the selfishness of the people from Zeal. Themes like that really spoke to me on an emotional level, and this game is full of that kind of thing. I don't think that you have to have this weaving, involving narrative or plot in order to evoke those kinds of emotions. I think that those subtle moments, those moments where you experience the duality of humanity, how cruel and how compassionate it can be, can have the same emotional pull, basically. And I feel like Chrono Trigger, while being simpler in the way its plot is delivered, is full of those kinds of themes that make it an emotional experience for me. So that's my response to that. I'd love to hear what you guys have to say and what you think in regards to whether Chrono Trigger can tell an emotionally gripping story despite the fact that it is kind of simple in the way it's delivered. Here was a great comment from and I'm sorry if I mess your name up, but the Alchememe, probably. Guy upstairs is running water. He says, "I haven't played Chrono Trigger, but that's exciting to me." And he was referencing a certain part of the video. I know a lot of people's favorite game is Majora's Mask 2. One of my favorite speakers, Jason Love, said something like, "The thing that separates humans from other animals is our ability to communicate, not in the present moment, because other animals can do that, but to communicate ideas through time, using written words, symbols, art, and so forth. Unlike movies and books, video games can illustrate this fact about human nature in the most potent way, by letting us actually be a causal agent, letting us interact with the game world and see the effects of our actions playing out in a timeline, as opposed to reading or watching a character. We're active participants. This might be an obvious thing to say, but watching causality play out is especially powerful when we get to see that we caused a positive effect to take place in time. That's an experience that, apart from doing it in real life, you can only get in a video game. It's an interesting correlation that Chrono Trigger, Majora's Mask, and Ocarina of Time are some of the most highly regarded video games of all time." I thought that was a really astute observation and comment, and a really, really cool perspective, and something I hadn't really thought about, that Chrono Trigger, Majora's Mask, and Ocarina of Time, all of which involve time travel, moving through time, seeing, Majora's Mask a little bit less so, maybe, just because it's over the course of 3 days. But to some extent, all of these games where you can basically, as he puts it, become a causal agent and interact with the world and see those effects playing out over the course of time, could be one of the reasons why they are so highly regarded. And it brought to my mind an episode from Cosmos, the most recent version of Cosmos that featured Neil deGrasse Tyson as the host. I don't know if you guys have seen that. I believe it's still on Netflix and you should totally watch it. But there was one episode where they were talking about how, it wasn't necessarily like the theme or like the main thesis of the episode, but they were talking about how as soon as we began to record or write stories, that we clung to that as a means of kind of immortality, where we are very limited beings in terms of our lifespans. We're not around for very long. We're mortal, obviously, but we look for a way to preserve our lives. And written words, art, all these things that he mentioned, or that he quoted Jason Love saying, symbols and words and art can be used to communicate through time, which is kind of a form of immortality, if you follow my meaning there. And so I don't know, I want to see what you guys maybe think about that, like the time travel aspect of it, the fact that being able to communicate through time, to be able to make changes or have a causal effect throughout time, is such an appealing concept to so many people, because these three games are so highly regarded. Of course, you could also argue they're just very well made games, very fun to play. It's not necessarily because of the time travel aspect, but I wonder if that does have an effect on the enjoyment people have from these games. So I thought that was a really cool comment. Just wanted to share that real quick and get some of your thoughts. Okay, here's one from Toasty Groover. Basically, I'll kind of sum up what his thing is, because I don't want this to run on too long, because there's still a whole nother thing I got to get into. That's kind of the meat of what this discussion is going to be about. But basically, he described a lot of the things that make this game a benchmark, that make this game so amazing, makes it one of the greatest of all time. One thing he gets into a little bit here was, I want to touch upon equipment customization mentioned in the video. I disagree that enemies needed strategy. In fact, I feel like I progressed through the game without problems, really. Now, he goes on to say that that's because the game's difficulty progressed at a perfect pace in his perspective. That nothing ever felt like it was too difficult, but that it felt like he was kind of progressing, and that the game's difficulty were progressing really evenly. I still disagree with you, Toasty Groover. I don't know how long it's been since you've played the game or whatever. Maybe it was recently, but from the playthrough I'm doing right now, there are many, many instances where I have switched to weapons that were lower in terms of physical damage because they boosted magic. Or I put on armor that gave me elemental resistances that I need, even though they significantly decreased my physical defense. Or, I needed protection from dark energy, or from fire, or from lightning, or whatever. So, while there might be an argument made that you don't necessarily have to or need to do that to progress, there are many, many instances where it is useful and strategically sound to equip certain kinds of armor, even if it's not technically your best armor in your arsenal, in order to have a little bit of an easier time against specific things that the boss or the enemies in the area will do to you. So, have to disagree with you on that point. However, you do go on to say, he touched on a little bit of the 4 equipment slots and how he doesn't feel like that's dumbed down, and I agree with you there too. Biggest gripe I have with the game, this is what I want to get into, the lack of character development. While I agree that side quests relate to the characters, I do not think that the game develops its characters very well. Some characters do not develop at all. I'm not saying characters do not have meaningful things to say, or that they don't reflect in a meaningful way on the story. What I miss is actual development, because the characters at the end of the game are still exactly the same as they were at the beginning. Yes, even Magus, or Magus. I think that overall, you're probably right about that, and I think that that's probably a good thing to bring up. And for the most part, I would agree. Characters like Chrono obviously are not developed at all, because they're meant to be more or less just a player avatar, as silent protagonists generally are. I think if I were to disagree in any sense with you here, it would be with Marl, or Marley, or however you pronounce her name, and Frog, specifically. I feel like Marley starts the game out as very rebellious and very much just wanting to get away from her father. She has real problems with her father. And while it does take an optional side quest to resolve that, I do feel like she matures quite a bit throughout the process of the game, and is able to kind of come to grips with the way her father is, like his personality, and to accept it, and to accept him for who he is, and to love him despite his faults. And I do feel like she makes some good progress from beginning to end to becoming a more mature, open-minded person, and not quite this like stubborn, rebellious type. It's not character development on the level that we see in Final Fantasy games, but I do think it's there, and I do think it is meaningful. I would also disagree with Frog. I think Frog makes a pretty big change from beginning to end of the game. He starts out very, I don't want to say timid is the right word, but just reluctant to face his demons, reluctant to step up and be the hero that Cyrus, his mentor, told him that he could be. He was weak and then became strong throughout the course of the game. So for those two characters, I do think they had decent character development. With the other characters, I think specifically with characters like Ayla and Robo, maybe you don't see quite so much. I do think there is some with Luca, maybe not as much as those other two characters I described. Obviously with Chrono, like I said, nothing there. Magus I can agree with, and I think that has something to do with the fact that he's an optional character, but you don't see that kind of development, say, with like Yuffie or Yuffie from Final Fantasy VII, or even really like Vincent, all too much within the game itself. You get it in later games and material kind of outside of the game, but not so much in the game. I think that might have an effect on why Magus doesn't change too much from beginning to end. Anyways, that's all I have to say on that, but I'd like to see what everyone else thinks in terms of character development. I think that we can definitely agree that character development isn't this game's strongest suit, but that the characters, while maybe not evolving tremendously from beginning to end, are still very interesting characters who have, like you said, meaningful things to say. So, good points there. Good points there. Glad that you brought all that stuff up. While I'm kind of like looking for what point in here that I wanted to bring up about our conversation, one thing that many people said, or two things many people said in the comments, I heard it repeated many times, was one, people thought the game was too easy, and two, people didn't like Chrono being a silent protagonist. So I want to touch on those two things real fast. At the time I uploaded this video, and I think I did say it in this, I would have agreed that the game is too easy. Then I started playing it on the stream the next day, and anyone who joined in that stream saw me struggling particularly against the Magus fight. There was one other fight later that I didn't beat on the first attempt. I died and had to come back, and I started thinking, like, what's going on here? Like, I had what I thought were solid strategies that had worked for me in the past. Why did I die so many times on these boss fights? And what it came down to was the fact that I had forgotten that I had turned the battle speed all the way up on a previous play session, and it was really, really affecting me. And when I turned the battle speed, it was all the way up at its highest. When I turned it down back to the middle into half, I kind of blazed through those fights. They weren't even difficult for me at all. And I kind of realized that the battle speed in that game is almost like a difficulty slider. And when it's all the way up, enemies get their turns pretty dang quickly and can attack lots of times, and it can be really difficult to manage and beat them. Now, that being said, I did make some major mistakes in the Magus fight. I didn't use Frog's Masamune to lower his magic defense, and I, in one battle, forgot that Robo had already unlocked Heal Beam, so I wasn't using that. I was using healing items. So there were definitely some things that, because I was streaming, I wasn't thinking about, and that played a part in it feeling more difficult. But that being said, some of those fights were made quite a bit more difficult by the fact that that the battle speed was turned all the way up. So that might be something to look into if you thought in the past that Chrono Trigger's too hard, or too easy, I mean. Try playing it with the battle speed all the way up. Also, I think that there are some fights kind of towards the end of the game that one of the viewers in the stream mentioned, you know, it's kind of like a puzzle trying to put some of those things together and figure them out. And I do agree with that. I don't think every single boss fight in the whole game, you just breeze through it, it's easy, especially on your first playthrough. There were a couple boss fights I definitely struggled with on my first time playing the game. And so I don't think it's fair to label it as like this really easy game per se, but it's definitely not. It's definitely on the easier side as far as JRPG goes. But try playing it with the battle speed all the way up. Now, in terms of Chrono as a silent protagonist, silent protagonists have never bothered me. I think that my response to that would be, does Link bother you as a character? Do you think Link is a bad character because he's a silent character? You know, Landon brought up in one of our videos we made, it was one of our Q&A videos a couple months ago, that Link is one of his favorite characters in game because it's an interesting approach as a character study. You only learn about the character through the interactions with other people, what other people say to you, and how they react to you. And that's kind of an interesting approach for putting together who this person is. You know, I agree that with that a lot of people kind of write off silent protagonists as like, oh, they have no depth, there's nothing there to learn about that character. And obviously there's some truth to that, and to some extent I can't agree with that, because they're leaving it open for the player to fill that character with their own traits, because he's an avatar for the player himself or herself. And I think that that's wonderful. I think that that's fine. I feel like there's nothing wrong with that approach at all. I feel like it's a great approach. At the same time, I do feel like there's some characterization that happens in silent protagonists. And in most of these cases with silent protagonists, they're not actually silent. Like, there are many places in the Zelda series where it is implied that Link speaks, that he explains something to a character. We just don't hear it. We don't get to read what he said. It just kind of like skips past that part, and you hear you see the ... from the character listening to what he's saying, and then the response to it. And in a lot of ways, what the characters say in response to him give us indications of the character's personality and characterization. And I think that that is an interesting approach to character development that I don't think we should be overlooking just because it's not a more conventional character with an arc that we can actually see and follow throughout the game, if that makes sense. Let me know what you guys think about that. Okay, now we're going to jump into the big one. The big one. And this is the one I'm still working on myself to understand completely. So that's why I want to bring it up, and I want you guys to talk to me about it. So I had a little bit of a conversation here with Tim Northrup. Okay, so this is where Tim and I got into a little bit of a discussion about how time travel works. He says, to me, you can have this kind of simple or this kind of comprehensive, and don't worry about what he's referencing there. The two together make your characters central to the entire planetary history in a way that I find plotting. Rise, fall, and salvation are on their backs and consciences. The world as it stands is too dependent on them. You can't construct a counter-narrative that makes sense in a universe where Chrono, Marl, Luca were never born, as without them the world might not exist in recognizable form. So we got into a discussion about this, and what ended up happening by the result of it, he said, you know, that you basically perceive it or interpret it this way, I interpret it this way, we'll leave it at that. But here's the thing, I don't think it's an interpretive point. I think that, and this, I thank you though. I thank you, Tim. I think that you brought up really, really interesting points in that discussion. And you have made me think about this a lot harder than I ever would have otherwise. And it has led to this, like, just series of different things I've been trying to look into about how the game's time travel works, how it actually operates, and really understanding the lore on this particular point. So thank you for bringing this up, because I didn't understand it. Even the way that I describe it is actually not correct. I didn't have a correct understanding of the way time travel works in this. So in one way, we were both missing the mark in our kind of argument back and forth. But what it seems to me is that his understanding of this was that there's a singular timeline, and that, to put it in a simple term, because I can't think of a better word, that there's a destiny applied to it. So everything that comes to pass in the world is because of the influence of the characters in the past. Because the characters went back and changed these things, the world was shaped in such a way that it led to the events of the beginning of the game and the birth of the characters. And that, as he puts it, you can't construct a counter-narrative that makes sense in a universe where Chrono, Marl, and Luca were never born, as without them the world might not exist in recognizable form. If what you're saying was true, then the future that Chrono sees when he goes into 2300 AD, that kind of desolate future where Lavos has destroyed the world, would be set in stone. That, no matter what the characters do leading up to that moment, it won't be able to be changed because their influence would have led into that future, right? The influence that they had on the past, the influence that they had on the world as a whole, led up to a future that resulted there. It's kind of like a singular timeline construct. At least is if I'm understanding what you're saying correctly. Maybe I'm misinterpreting you, but that isn't the case, obviously, because they do defeat Lavos. There is a future that's bright and that's happy, and where Lavos is killed, and whether or not, or despite some of the changes that they go back and make in the past, a lot of the same things do end up happening. Like, for instance, key moment in 65 million BC is Lavos crashing, descending into the Reptite, like, country, if you want to call it that, their little region on the continent, destroying their capital and basically causing the extinction of that entire race. That happened despite the actions that the main party had there. And that set a set of events in motion that led to humans being the dominant species rather than the Reptites. If Lavos had not crashed, then the Reptites obviously were a superior race, more intelligent, and would have basically driven the humans to extinction. But Lavos striking at that particular point in time is what changed that. Then you have the Kingdom of Zeal, and this is where I hope I explained it correctly. But basically what happened in the original timeline, before there became divergent timelines, based on the characters going back and having an impact on the events. In the original timeline, they awoke Lavos, and Balthazar, Melchior, and Gaspar, is that his name? I think it's his name. And Yanis are all sent to different time periods, like these gates open up that send them to different places in time. One to the end of time, one to 1 to 600 AD, 1 to 1000 AD, and 1 to 2300 AD. So that event occurred, and after that you come into 600, and then the Kingdom of Zeal is destroyed, obviously, by Lavos because they awaken it. Then in 600 AD you have Magus, who is basically bent on revenge on Lavos. He does a summoning to awaken Lavos and tries to attack and fight it there and defeat it, and obviously loses. And that leads to the humans basically winning that war that was being waged between the mystics, or the fiends, and humans during 600 AD, which leads into 1000 AD and their, celebration of that the victory of that war, and in Chrono's time. And then after that you have the Day of Lavos, where he basically destroys everything. You have the rise of artificial intelligence, and essentially a chain of events that leads to the world being destroyed, and Lavos spawn being sent out into the cosmos to go infect more planets. That timeline is what happens without the influence of the main party. If they never time travel, that is what happens. Exactly as it happens. Now, where the timeline diverges is mostly in 12,000 BC and then 680, where the differences are that Magus does not die fighting Lavos, because Frog and company come in and fight him and prevent him from basically summoning Lavos during that ritual that he was performing there in the castle. And so Magus does not die fighting Lavos there. He and the party are teleported to different points in time. So that was the first truly divergent thing that they changed in the timeline there. And so that set off a different kind of chain of events where Magus was still alive. He was able to go back to his original timeline and try to fight Lavos at the source, or what the source is for him at the time, right before he got sent into the future in the first place. I feel like I'm rambling here, but I guess my central point is that it's clear to me that there are divergent timelines that occur in the story, and that has been consistent with what I've been reading from the developers and some of the other theories that I'm reading about too. Now, that has led into some just really intense sort of explanations for how time travel works in the game, and I guess that's more of a result of the idea of time travel being a very complex thing than it is necessarily of the story necessarily being complex. Like, the story, I think we can all agree, is fairly simple, but time travel is very complex. But there were some really cool, and this is a thing I bring up again because there was another viewer who was talking about there being a lot of plot holes in the game, and I think that can definitely be perceived basically because it's a time travel game, and anytime there's a story about time travel, there's just so many paradoxes involved with time travel that it's really hard to derive some consistency there. And but there are kind of two principles in particular that I looked up that really help make it feel more consistent, and I'm going to put these links in the description. They're both to the Chrono Compendium, and one concept is called Time Traveler's Immunity, and the other is called Time Bastard. So Time Travel Immunity basically, I mean, it's kind of self-explanatory, but those who travel through time, those who are the time travelers, are immune to the consequences of the changes that are made. And what that means is essentially that there is no grandfather paradox in the game. And this is where there is one flaw in the way that one kind of major flaw in the way the story is delivered. Because they describe in detail what the grandfather paradox is when Luca comes back and finds Chrono in 600 AD and Marl has disappeared. Which is interesting because Marl doesn't disappear at the death of Queen Leene, but only at the threat of the death of Queen Leene. which doesn't make sense. If the queen isn't dead yet, then Marl shouldn't disappear. That possibility of her being born by Lean being killed hasn't actually manifested, hasn't actually come to pass yet she still disappears only at the threat of it happening. But the truth about it is that in this game, the way it operates, the grandfather paradox would make a lot of it fall apart, except in the instance where they've implied this rule called time traveler's immunity. And I'm going to let you guys read over this because it's a little difficult to kind of wrap your head around it at first. But the idea is that, let me just go ahead and read this. The unifying principle behind time traveler's immunity is that once an entity travels through time, he or she is disconnected from the original timeline by changing history, past or future, and causality and consequences are resultingly broken. And then it goes on to say, time traveler's immunity has other ramifications, namely the emergence preservation corollary. Imagine that you go back in time to 1999 AD and murder Chrono a full year before he began to travel through time. What occurs in 1000 AD? Does the ruined future magically come back? He means, after the game's been completed and you've destroyed Lavos, and the future has been changed now to be a happy future. What if happened if you go back in time to 1999 and kill Chrono before he has a chance to get this whole journey started in the first place? Does the old future come back? And here it says that it would not. Under time traveler's immunity, a time traveler's actions are preserved in the past. Basically what this is saying is that once a person has time traveled into the past and done something, that event is preserved under time traveler immunity. You can't prevent that time jump from happening by killing a person before they time jump. Basically, anything that they do after time traveling into a different portion of history is preserved under time traveler's immunity. Now, when you really sit here and think hard about this, obviously you can find some holes in that logic. But that's a result of time travel itself not making sense, not necessarily Chrono Trigger's version of time travel not making sense. Time travel is just a difficult concept to wrap your head around. It's just, there are problems with it that when you really think about it, it's hard to grasp. It's hard to make it make sense. Another interesting rule, I guess you want to call it that, is what's called time bastard. And this I found very interesting because there was something somebody brought up in the comments again, that he didn't think it made sense that every time you go back to 1000 AD, you're not seeing a duplicate Chrono. Time bastard principle basically says that there cannot be a version of you in the future. Like if you time travel into the future, you will not see another version of yourself. That it's impossible to do that because that would essentially be breaking a scientific law. It would basically be violating the conservation of energy principle of the universe. I won't get into what that is for now. If you don't know what it is, look up conservation of energy. You can't create something from nothing, right? So, anyways, what this says is that you can go back, as is evidenced in the game, you can go back in time and see a previous version of yourself. But you cannot go into the future and see a duplicate version of yourself in the future. And the kind of explanation for that is that even when you go back in time and you change an event, let's say you went back in time and you altered events to where the world you grew up in would be much different. So say, in Chrono's time, the world's kind of at peace. What if he went back in time and changed events to where the Mystics win the war and he grows up in a world where humans were enslaved, and he lived a very much darker life in his upbringing. Would that affect the current time traveler Chrono? Would his memories then change? Would his experiences then change? Would his personality change? Because he should have grown up in a totally different world now. The idea is that no, his original timeline is preserved. It's a divergent timeline, and his timeline is preserved kind of in the outer darkness, the end of time somewhere, right? Now, those events have changed into a divergent timeline, but his memories are still preserved, and he is immune to the consequences or effects of that change. And his world, his timeline that he came from, is still preserved for him. Now, what this means is that even this new version of Chrono, who grows up in the darker world, once he reaches the exact point in time where the original Chrono time traveled, he can no longer exist. He has to cease existing at that time. Otherwise, it's breaking the law of conservation of energy. So that Chrono then ceases to exist. He cannot continue to go further beyond that exact point of time where Chrono began time traveling. These principles are kind of difficult to explain and a little tough to grasp, but that's why I want to bring them up, because I want to get you guys your thoughts on them. So I've put these links in the description below to these articles. There's also a video series that somebody shared with me in the comments last week. Talks a whole lot about this stuff. So I'd love to get your thoughts on the principles of time and how time travel works in the series, why you think it may be a consistent model or an inconsistent model in your view after reading all of these things, and maybe help me explain it in a way that I can understand a little better. I'm obviously going to keep going through this. I'm going to keep reading it. I'm going to keep looking up stuff. I'm going to keep reading interviews. There's lots more resources I need to look into. But this is actually pretty complex stuff, a lot more complex than I had given the game credit for in the beginning. So a lot of people saying, oh, the story's too simple. The game doesn't have a lot of the same kind of like communal sort of theory and discussion about certain points. It's here too. And I was kind of surprised to find that. You see that all the time in Final Fantasy communities and people discussing the game, but there's a lot of really deep kind of stuff they're talking about here. And again, it's more about time travel itself than it is necessarily about this game. But this game does apply certain rules to avoid some of those time traveling paradoxes. Is that the right word for plural for paradox? But I'd love to get your thoughts on some of this stuff, and hopefully I can learn and glean some of your wisdom and knowledge on these principles, because I don't understand them perfectly myself, so obviously I can't explain them in a way that's perfectly comprehensible. Anyways, I've been rambling on for long enough. There's a lot of stuff to digest here, a lot of stuff to talk about. Look at all of the links in the description to kind of expand your understanding about these principles and about the game in general, and then let's keep talking in the comments. Thank you guys for watching. Thank you for being beasts, and I will see you again very, very soon. I will do a live stream tomorrow, and then I'll have a new video coming in on Monday, and then we'll start podcasts, because a lot of you guys asked for podcasts. We'll be starting a podcast every Wednesday that we'll release. So a lot of good stuff coming. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned.